tools you will need, you'll need a 10, a 12, and a 14 millimeter socket, a 17 millimeter box wrench, vice grips to help you remove the retaining clip on the emergency brake cable and help remove the cable itself. Torque wrench, not essential, but if you really want to be accurate when you retighten the banjo bolt, you can use it, or you can just estimate and you'll actually be fine with that. Hammer and screwdriver to help get off washers that you need to reuse, and to encourage retaining clips to get back on. Hammers I always find is a good tool to have around. Very optional here. These are called transit screws. They hold the rotor to the hub. These will make it easier when you go to put the calipers on. To keep the rotor stable. You don't have to have it, but it does make life easier. And last, again, have to call it an optional item, PB Blaster. If, in my case, I was replacing these calipers, I assume the calipers that were on there had been on there since the car was made 13 years ago. I always worry about bolts rusting and freezing in place. And if one of those bolts does shear off when I go to remove it, I've taken a small job and made a big job out of it. So to me, it's well worth spraying with PB Blaster ahead of time, anything you know you're going to remove, and let it set for a couple hours. Just an easy way to avoid big problems. After you've replaced your calipers, you will need to bleed the brakes just as you would anytime you bleed brakes. Same tools. 10 millimeter box wrench, a collector jar for the brake fluid. You do want to flush your system really well, make sure there are no air bubbles, make sure it's fresh, good fluid coming through. And the brake fluid, if it gets on your paint, will ruin the paint of your car. So you want to collect it. You don't want it just spraying all over the garage. So I do recommend getting one of these collector bottles if you do not already have one. Makes life a lot easier. And of course you need brake fluid. Now you can use .3 if you're just driving on the street. If you're only once in a while going out Friday nights and racing with your Fast and Furious friends on Friday evenings, .3 will be perfectly fine. However, you're driving on the track where you're accelerating, braking, the heat builds up, you want to use a .4, and that's what I do. This is a track car for me, so I do want to use .4. It's not real high tech, but just to make my life easier, everything I take off, I put into a small box. That way when I go to put back on, I know where everything is, every washer, every bolt, every nut, flange, whatever. Locking clip is there. And if I wind up with an extra part at the end, I better go back and figure out what I forgot to do. Okay, in this video on how to replace the rear calipers on a Honda S2000, problem we have with the rear calipers is that they do over time get stiff. They don't release completely, as I've found out. Been wearing my brake pads very, very quickly. 3 days to the track and the pads are gone, and it feels like I'm driving like I'm low on power. Well, it's because my rear brakes are never releasing completely, so they do need to be replaced. But first thing is get your car safely jacked up, take the wheels off of this so you have good access and good light. Inside the car, be sure to release the parking brake to take the tension off the cable. When you go to replace your caliper, you will need to disconnect this, the banjo bolt right here that has your brake line coming to it with the fluid in it. If you just remove this, fluid will continue to drip out the entire time your caliper is disconnected. So a trick to prevent that from happening is to make a custom brake holder for your car. Here is a piece of wood. It happens to be just a piece of excess hardwood we had from building a house that I've cut with a notch in one end, and it's custom fitted for my Honda. Here you can see the piece of wood holding the brake pedal down. This, by keeping the master brake cylinder compressed, will prevent only a few drops of brake fluid to be coming out once you've disconnected the line, rather than the whole reservoir emptying. Of course, the downside is that now your brake lights are going to be on, and if you're going to be quick about this job, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to take a long time, this would be an excellent time to disconnect your battery. So first thing we're going to do is remove the banjo bolt here. There are two washers. We will make sure we keep them because we will need them when we reinstall it. Do not lose them. That's a 14 millimeter. There's a bracket that holds the brake line here, and that's a 10 millimeter. And then
this covering bracket for the parking brake cable needs to be removed too. And these three are all 10s. That's a 14. If you work on Hondas much, you'll realize that most bolts are either 10, 12, or 14. There are, of course, exceptions, but 90, probably 8% of all the bolts and nuts on a Honda will be described by one of those metric sizes. So we'll go ahead and remove all three of those, or all four of those bolts rather. When we take off the banjo bolt, there will be some leakage. I've put a paper towel down here on the floor just to pick that up, and it will drain a little bit, but all it's going to drain is what's a little bit in the line from here to about here, and that's going to it. No fluid's going to come from the reservoir because I've got that piece of wood holding the brake down firmly, which I am going to leave in until I've finished both sides, and then I'll take that out and bleed the brakes at that time. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove these. So after removing this flange covering the cover, I did discover that there is one more bolt right behind here. So there's actually two bolts holding the brake line in place there, so we got to remove that second bolt. Now we're ready to remove the banjo bolt, and there will be some brake fluid dripping when I remove this, so I'll have to put my camera down and do it. It won't be much, but I do want to get that out of the way and be as neat as possible. Now when you remove the banjo bolt, there's two washers, one that goes directly against the caliper on one side of the brake line, and then the other washer goes right up against the head of the bolt on the opposite side of the brake line. You do need these unless you happen to have some spares or new ones. You'll have to reuse these. You're not supposed to reuse these. These are supposed to be single use, one time only. I've reused them many times and not had any problems, but if you have fresh ones, that'd be great. But in any case, make sure you recover both these washers. If you don't, and you, as when I took this bolt off of this caliper, the one washer stuck to the caliper, and had I just thrown the caliper out, I would have been a washer short. And with brake fluid, you have to have these washers. These are essential. Also, for those of you not familiar with banjo bolts are hollow, and they have a hole. If you can see it right, if I roll it, there it is, hole right there. And that's what allows the brake fluid to go from the line into the calipers. Because these are hollow, they're not as strong. That's why when you go to retighten these banjo bolts, you do them snug, but do not over torque them. I don't know the exact torque setting on these. I'm sure it's in the Honda manual. I'll try to find that before we put this back together. But in any case, do not over tighten. If you do, you can shear the bolt, and just as I say, that's a very, very bad day if you do that.
Okay, now we're looking up from underneath, and what we're seeing here is where the brake cable is hooked to the lever that engages the brake when you pull the parking brake. There are three things we need to do. We need to put a pair of vice grips on here, move this arm this way, then there's a slot. This comes off the end of the hook. I'll disconnect the cable, and then the last thing we do is have to pull that pin. We can pull the cable out and everything's clear. This is the trickiest part. It takes some wrenching around and some playing with the vice grips, and a little bit of cussing helps too in this case. Once you've got that, then the brake line will be clear, and all I have to do is remove the calipers and discard them. Okay, so now we have the brake cable free. Obviously, when we reattach it, we put the new calipers on. But this caliper, other than the bolts that actually hold the mounting, is ready to be removed. There are, if we haven't discussed it before, if you look right here, 14 millimeter bolt, and there's one up on top. That's all that holds the mounting bracket on. So you can go ahead, loosen those, take them off, and we're good to go. One thing that will make your job easier when you go to reinstall your new calipers is putting on what are called transit screws. These, I don't know the exact size of them. Had to order them from Honda, but I found them to work very well. And all you do is put them in here. It's to hold the rotor in place and keep it stable. And this is much better done with two hands, so I'll go ahead and turn this off for a moment while I put this on. If your calipers are in good shape, once you've undone the large 14 millimeter bolts on the back that hold the mounting bracket, the whole caliper assembly will slide right off. However, my caliper is not good. It's not releasing. It's dragging, so it's locked on to the rotor, so I'm having to use a little forcing it off. That is not your normal technique, but if this caliper was good, I wouldn't be replacing it. So if you have a bad caliper like that, you might need to hammer a little bit. Not your first choice, but it's what you need to do in an emergency. The old caliper on the left, and the new caliper that I'm going to replace it with on the right. The brake pads are actually good. My old brake pads, it was the caliper that sucked, but the brake pads were good. So I'm going to use the same brake pads when I put this back on. One thing to note on the new caliper is there is a dust cap right there protecting the caliper from having dirt and grit get in it until it's actually mounted and you're ready to connect the brake line. So do not take that out until you're ready to reconnect the banjo bolt and the brake line. That's just to keep any garbage from getting inside the caliper and causing it to malfunction. All right, next step is we will start reversing and start putting everything back on. For ease of reinstallation, you can disassemble the caliper from the mounting bracket here. There are 2 bolts here you need to remove. These are 12s and on the other side are 17s. These are, you can take these out. They're long pegs that will slide out, and then you mount this bracket first, put the brake pads in, then go ahead and mount the caliper back on. Very easy. I'll show you in a moment. Here you can see the mounting bracket and the caliper separated. So we put the mounting bracket on first, then we'll just reassemble, putting those bolts in and hinging the caliper into place after we've put the brake pads in next to the rotors. Just to reiterate, one of the brake pads has pegs on it. That is the pad that will go on the inside. The other brake pad has no pins on the back of the pad, on the backing plate, and that goes to the outside. And when you look in, you can see that cross hex on the piston is where that pin needs to fit. So the pin always goes on the inside with the Honda rear brakes. Front brakes are similar, except they have no pins. They're completely flat. So here we've got the mounting bracket back on. So tighten both of the caliper bolts using the 14 and the 17 millimeter. Get both of them. This one down here too, it's a little hard to see. Yep, there we go, right there. Make sure they're tight. Okay, so next step now is to reconnect parking brake cable. So we'll slide that in. And get that all the way up. There we go. First is to put the clip on there, and second will be to wrestle this one here, which actually, wow, much easier to get that on than it was to get off. All I gotta do is put the clip on there, and that's going to be it for the parking brake. Okay, that's just a slide on. You can slide from any direction you want, it doesn't matter. So we usually need just a little bit of encouragement, and that's it. So we got that done. Last thing is going to be to hook up the brake line itself. Now the brake line, of course, you'll first do the mounting bolts here, and then the last thing you do is put the banjo bolt in there. So the last step now in assembly is to attach the brake line with the banjo bolt. We now will remove this plastic covering, take that out, and we put the banjo bolt. Remember, copper washer, then the bolt, and then another copper washer. So there's a copper washer on both sides of the brake line fitting here. When we torque it down, don't want to over torque it. I will find out for you in just a moment what the proper torque is. All right,
So the proper torque for this, according to the Honda manual, is 25 foot-pounds. So we will torque it. There we go. And that is done. Now, caliper installation on this side, which was the right side of the car, is completely done, except for bleeding the brakes, because I am planning on replacing the left caliper. I will come back to bleeding after I finish replacing that caliper. So we'll be back in a few minutes. Quick check of my box shows it to be empty, so I don't have any leftover parts. That's always a very good sign. Don't forget to remove the 2 transit screws. Because the fluid will come out, flow up there, go down. Any air bubbles will get stuck up here. You can tell when there's no more air coming out of the brake fluid. Yeah, that's better.